Now let's go over question number 929, unique email addresses. Every valid email consists of a local name and a domain name, separated by the @ sign. Besides lowercase letters, the email may contain one or more dot, a period, or a plus. For example, alice@leetcode.com. Alice is the local name and leetcode is the domain name. So anything that comes before or after the @ sign is the domain name. Anything that becomes before the @ sign is the local name. If you add periods between some characters in the local name part of an email address, mail sent there will be forwarded to the same address without dots in the local name. So that's a key point. So this is key point number 1. Note that this rule does not apply to domain names. And that makes sense because, well, if you were to have leetcode.com and if you were to get rid of this dot, it would be leetcode.com without a dot. And obviously, we wouldn't be able to send an email to this address, right? So it only applies to our local part of our email address. For example, alice.z and alice.z forward to the same email address. If we were to have a dot again, we would want to get rid of that and send to this email, Alice without a dot between Alice and Z. If you add a plus in the local name, everything after the first plus sign will be ignored. Now, this is our second condition. Well, if you were to have a plus in our local name, everything after it will be ignored. This allows certain emails to be filtered. Note that this rule does not apply to domain names. Again, this rule does not apply to domain names, only to local. Now, we were given 2 rules. The first one was that a dot will be ignored in the local name. Second one is anything after the plus sign will be ignored in the local name along with the plus sign. For example, my.y plus name at email.com will be forwarded to my@email.com because we want to get rid of this dot and get rid of all the characters that come after the plus sign along with the plus sign too. Given an array of strings emails where we send one email to each email at index I, return the number of different email addresses that actually receive emails. So you want to return the number of unique email addresses. Let's look at our example 1. Well, we have our email addresses. We know that we want to get rid of this dot. We want to get rid of this Alex along with the plus sign because we know that we have to ignore all the characters that come after the plus sign. And for this one, it's going to be get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this part. Next one is we just get rid of this plus David. And how many email addresses are we going to be getting? Well, it's going to be 1, 2, and 3. But you have to keep in mind that we want unique email addresses, right? And if you look at our 1 and 2, they actually result to same thing. So test email at leetcode.com. And I actually forgot to get rid of this part. We have plus bob.kathy. So this will be test email at leetcode.com along with this one. So we have a duplicate. So we're going to give an output of 2. And our next example is pretty straightforward. Our local names are just single characters and we don't really have to edit anything. So we just return it as it is and get an output of 3, which we have over here. And output was 2 over here. Now again, when you try to implement this solution, figure out a way to separate 2 things. One is local and the other one is our domain. And we know that domain comes after @ and local comes before @ sign. And there are 2 conditions. First one is we want to get rid of all the dots. And second one is we want to get rid of all the characters that come after the plus. And we only get rid of up to our local part. We just leave our domain as it is. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks. Now let's implement our first solution, and our first solution is going to have a time complexity of O of n squared and space of O of n. What we're going to do is we're going to actually create a set, and that's going to be where we are going to store our output. And if you know how sets work, sets only store unique values. So if it is a case that our email happened to be the exact same thing after we did our operations, this way we will only obviously count the number of unique email addresses. So we are going to use sets. So first, let's create our sets to store our result. We're going to call it output, and this is going to be new sets. And let's just return that over here, and it should be not sets, it should be set. Okay, that looks good. And what we'll do now is we're going to iterate through all the emails in our array, and we're going to separate them into two parts, the local part and the domain part. So let's create our for loop to do that. And let's use a for of loop. We'll call it email of emails. Now let's first get our domain part first because that's easier. Now, how do we get the domain part? Well, we know that anything that comes after the @ is going to be our domain. But let's include our @ because we want to later add our edited local part and our domain part. So to do that, let's create a variable to first store our domain. And how can we really extract the domain part? Well, what we can do is we can use slice. We'll use slice, and we're going to slice it starting from where the @ is. So starting at that index. Well, how can we get the index of our @? What we can do is we'll use index of. So let's do email.index of, and we pass in our @ and we get our domain. So let's console log our domain. Here you can see that we are getting all the domains for our email addresses. So that's looking good. Now is the hard part, which is our local name of our email. Let's create a variable named local, and we want to do some operations on our email, current email, and we're going to change some methods. So like our domain, we want to slice or cut out our email addresses, the local part only. So that's going to be all the characters before our @. So let's do that. So it's going to look similar to our domain part. So slice, we pass in 0 because we want to start at index 0, and we do email, and we do index of, and we look for the @. And let's actually console log our local part. Here you can see that we are getting all the local parts. So it's looking good. But now we want to be able to get rid of all the characters, including the + and all the characters that come after the +. So let's handle that. And to do that, we're going to do pretty much the same thing. We're going to use slice and index of to find the + this time. So let's just copy this and just edit it. And we pass in our + instead of @. But one thing I want to mention right now is that you're going to get some kind of error, which we'll go over soon. Okay, so for the first 3, it's looking good. We were able to successfully get rid of all the + in our email. But if you look at our example 2, which is A@leetcode, B@leetcode, C@leetcode, it's giving us an empty string. Well, why is that? And the reason is because, well, all these email addresses, they don't have a +, right? So this index of is returning -1. And if you remember, if index of does not find +, it's going to return -1. So what we can do to remedy this situation is we just add a + to here. And if you were to do that, we would get our correct result. So it's looking good so far. And there is one last case that we have to handle. Well, we handled our case where we get rid of the + and all the characters after that. And now we have to get rid of all the instances of our dot. And to do that, we are going to use replace. And replace is going to require a regex. And let's pass in our regex. So this removes all or the first instance of our dot, but we want to remove it globally. So we pass in G, and we want to replace it. We want to replace it with an empty string. So if you were to do that, you can see that we get all our local part of our email address, and it's looking good. We were able to handle both of our cases. So that's now it for our local part. And now let's add our email to our output. But before we add it, we have to have a full comprehensive email with local and domain part. So what we're going to do is we want to push it into our output, right? Well, set does not actually have a push method. It instead has a add method. So it works like push, and we want to add our local plus our domain. And here you can see our email addresses, right? So for the first one, we have 2 emails. For the second one, we have 3 unique emails. But the question didn't ask us to return a list of our unique email address, but it asks for the number of unique email addresses. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually just return the size of our set, and you can see that we have 2 and 3 for this one, which is a correct solution. So think of size as length property in our array. So it's just giving us the length of our output, and this is actually it for our first solution. And now let's go over our code line by line. Now, first thing we did was we created our output, which is going to be a set. And remember that set only stores unique values. Now we iterate through all the email addresses and we create 2 parts to our email. First one is the domain, and we do that by using slice, and we slice it where the index of @ is. So for the first one, this is going to store at leetcode.com. And now we go to our local part, and remember, local part is the harder part, right? So same as before, what we do is we do slice, but we start at the beginning of our string and we do it up to our @. So at first, this is going to look test.email or plus Alex and the @ and we add the @ because of this plus sign, and we will go over why added this @. And then next, what we do is we find the index of this plus sign. So what that does to our email addresses, it gets rid of the plus sign along with Alex. And now we just have to be able to handle our dot. So to do that, we use replace, and this is just regex, and this G is doing this operation globally. So we want to get rid of all the instance of dot, and we replace it with an empty string. So that's going to result in email, test email. So we have our local and our domain. So finally, we add those 2 over here and add it to our output. And we do that for all the email addresses and return the size of our output later. Well, a key thing to note that talked about before is, well, remember that all these strings gave us empty string. It got rid of C, B, and A. And the reason was because before we didn't have this 1, right? And if we didn't have this 1, this index of is going to return a -1 because it's not going to find a plus for all of them. So this way we are, by adding 1 to our first line of slice, we are handling our edge case. So when we had a at, we will be getting rid of this and leave with our A along with our domain. So we add the combination of these 2 to our output and finally get our result. Now let's go over our second solution, and our second solution is actually going to have the exact same logic, except that it's going to be a little shorter, a little bit more efficient. So let's try coding it. First thing I want is we want to create our output, and this is actually going to be sets again. So new set, and let's return our output over here. And remember that we want to return the size. So let's do output.size. Okay, that looks good. And now we need to be able to iterate through our array of emails. So like before, let's create a for loop. This time we're going to destructure our email. So what we'll do is let's do local and our domain. And we want to structure it by, we get our email, and we're going to split it into 2 parts. Well, we know that everything before the @ is local and everything after it is domain. So what we do is we use a split operator to split it where the @ is. Now, if we were to console log our local, you can see that it's literally just giving us the local part. Now, if we were to console log our domain, you can see that it's giving us our domain. But the difference between our first one and our second solution is that, well, for the first one, the domain included the @ right? But this one doesn't. So when we add it to our output, we want to add a @ between local and our domain. Now we have to be able to handle our local email. And remember that we want to get rid of all the instance of our dot and every character that comes after the plus sign, including the plus sign. So let's handle our 2 conditions. What I want to do is I want to overwrite my local after I perform these operations. So same as before, I want my local, and this time I won't use slice, I will use split this time. So let's just split, and let's split where the plus sign is. And here you can see that we have two parts to our email now. So everything before the plus sign, everything after the plus sign. So what do you want? We want everything before the plus sign. So that's going to be the element at index 0. We ignore everything after our first element. So let's get our first element. That's going to be index 0. And so now you can see that we have our local part of our email. Now we just have to be able to get rid of the dots. And to do that, we use our replace. And if you remember from our replace, our regex is going to look something like this. And remember the G sign to make it global. And we replace it with an empty string. So we have our local part, and our local part is looking good. Now finally, we want to combine our local and domain part of our email and put it into our output. So let's do output.add. And remember that set does not have a push method, so we use add, and we do local plus, and remember that we have to add an @ sign and our domain. We finally get our result. And as you can see, we have 2 and 3, which is looking good, which is giving us the number of unique emails. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks.